We're recording. So I just want to start and say thank you everyone for joining us. We are really excited to be talking and learning more about Tenaya Izu's work today. And for anyone who's new to this, I'm Anders. I'm one of the studio managers here at BKLYN CLAY.
And I'm Gus. I'm the other studio manager here at BKLYN CLAY.
And the format will just be Tenaya is going to show some slides and we will sort of keep it conversational, but we'll be looking at images, learning more about the work. And if you have questions, you can just type them into the chat and Gus and I will sort of act as moderators to read those out. And just a brief bio, Tenaya was born in California and received an undergraduate degree from Columbia and has been working as an artist here in Brooklyn since.
Manhattan. Brooklyn and kind of.
But studio is currently in...
Yeah, it's in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, I've just been in my apartment, so I was like, I don't know where Brooklyn is.
Yeah. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. So should I get started?
Yeah, you can share your screen.
All right, let me close out these things. Oh wait, yeah, I have to do that on here. Sorry.
Do you want to use your cat as well?
Oh yeah, this is my cat, Ho-Ho. She's gonna be accompanying here. Okay, so starting share screen. Let's do view full screen. Okay, so I guess I mostly tailored this to things I've done with clay and things I've done with ceramic since I do work with other materials, but I started working with clay in like 2015 or something, and these are images from this group show that I had all these pieces that were made around the idea of a bathhouse. And I guess I was drawn to working with clay because I didn't have a studio and I was working out of my apartment, and it was a way to be able to work with material that wasn't just in my like shared living room. And I was interested in clay because it's such a ubiquitous material throughout history, used for so many different things. And I was drawn to this idea of the bathhouse, which I guess, as with a lot of work, when you look back on it, you're like, ah, but I, stand by it as an important thing that has brought me to where I am now. And it was going to this spa in New Jersey called King Spa, where I just saw you were just like naked and you're just hanging out with all these other people, and you can get like a body scrub where this like older lady in like a bra and underwear just like ruthlessly scrubs your naked body on a slippery table, and it's like very like erotic and also kind of scary because it's painful and like non-sexual, but like someone is like really scrubbing you intimately, and there is just a lot about like the slippery hard like steamy thing that I was really drawn to in thinking about intimacy and care. So these are some images from that. Anyway, and then I moved on to thinking about fan art a lot because from my undergrad education, we had to go through this like kind of canon of Western history and Western culture, which seemed, and thinking about like canon and culture, it always seems at least kind of arbitrary what becomes canon and what becomes like a defining cultural touchstone. And so just looking back, I was like really at the time invested in what is like what formed my cultural touchstone and what kind of like cultural production was ubiquitous in my formation of like reference points, I guess. And this keeps coming up for me, which is Inuyasha, which is by this manga artist, Rumiko Takahashi, who also made this series called Ranma One Half, which was about this guy who, when splashed with hot or cold water, I can't remember, would become a girl. And this series is about this like half demon, half human, who is like Nemesis, is also a half demon, half human. And they're both kind of like battling for safety and security, and like a more sense, they're like really torn up over their like sense of incompleteness and their sense of like lacking that they have, which, you know, I took with and ran with as it can speak to a lot of different types of hybrid identities, such as queerness and race in the US, but that's, you know, taking my own reading. And I was also really compelled by the proliferation I saw as a youth of fan art on the internet, and just thinking about so much art that I've seen throughout the years, and how there is this kind of arbitrariness in which what types of references are significant, or like when you reference a canon, when is it you're adding to what kind of cultural dialogue. So I was really, you know, taken with how much people really vibed with Inuyasha. And here's some more fan art that I found on the internet, like DeviantArt and other sites like that. So I made my own fan art about Inuyasha. And this quote says, "Neither one nor the other, not a demon, but not a human either, no place to belong. I thought the only way was to carve out your own space by force. That's how I survived. And by the time I knew what was happening, I was all alone." So the series really hinges on like friendship as a mode of survival, as opposed to ruthless independence and individualism, which is like this guy who is a demon and a human, and this guy who is also a demon and a human, but he has friends.
Aww.
How do I get out of this? So I made all these bas-reliefs of the characters, and I also tried to incorporate elements of cosplay using different fabrics that I imagined would be used in these cosplays. These are made out of porcelain and glazed with, I think, copper oxide wash, but I put it on pretty heavily so that it kind of like crystallized. Also just thinking about different types of cultural monuments, like temples and churches and those types of iconography used to tell stories that people are supposed to, you know what they're referencing. All right, so those guys, so this comes to, am I going too fast? No? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And so this is from a solo shot motel in like 2018, where there were elements outside of ceramics, but I'm focusing on those right now. And so I was really thinking about, in line with other work, I was thinking about history and ancestry and like kind of social formation, but particularly Asian American history in the US, and how the narratives I mostly hear are of like exceptionalism, and how exceptionalism plays such a big role in determining like whose histories are significant, or why, or justifying why a history in itself is significant, and why it is like a good history in terms of American history, or why it deserves to be recognized. So here's another image from that show without any ceramic stuff in it. So, oh yeah, at this time I also became really interested in rust as a material, because of its like connotations with blood, its connotations with industrial history, and just as like as a stain, or as like this kind of like solid that expands and touches everything and stains it throughout time. So here's another closer up image of this. And this butterfly was, coming from a lot of different places, but I was thinking about that really famous, forgot the philosopher's name, but there's that really famous quote about like, I had a dream that I was a butterfly or something, and then I woke up and I didn't know that if I was, dreaming of being a man and I was still a butterfly or something. And I don't know, as like this kind of like line that keeps floating around, and I'm not sure of where its origins are. I mean, I am, but I'm also not, because it's used so frequently. And also thinking about like M. Butterfly and Madame Butterfly, and that Weezer album that is based off of Madame Butterfly, and all of these like layers and layers and layers of cultural references to Asian women as butterflies and Asian people as like butterflies, and decorative butterfly, 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 and transformation. Yeah.
Is that piece, can I ask you about the piece? Oh, maybe I'll ask about this one since the image is up. It looks kind of more like rope or like thick string, but what is it, and what are you doing to create that one?
Oh, so this I crocheted out of rope.
It is okay.
Yeah, it's like really, really big, and it was nailed to the wall with railroad spikes. And I didn't have an image, but the railroad spikes actually go through the wall and are sticking out on the other side of the wall. And Motel was really nice to let me do that.
Did you, how did you acquire the railroad spikes?
eBay. But actually, as I've been walking around the Heights, I have, yeah, with Rachel, we've been going exploring up and up higher along the railroad tracks that Amtrak and the Metro North take. And there are actually just tons and tons of discarded railroad ties and spikes along the river that I could have gotten for free. So for next time, I know where to find these railroad spikes. And obviously drawn to railroad spikes because of their association with the Transcontinental Railroad and this kind of like manifest destiny idea of like marking territory and expanding a nation state, and the associated labor with it.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you about the piece in the corner too? I think it's like
Which one?
It's like floor in the corner, and I can't remember if it was actually what it.
Yeah, I had a slide of that and I deleted it, and that wasn't really that wasn't really conceived of as like a complete piece, but because the show was thinking so heavily about manifest destiny and this suburbanization of the US during the time preceding the war. This is, let me see if I can zoom in. This is actually some vinyl tiling that I got from the hardware store. And I was really struck as a kid by, my grandpa lived in what's it called? Like a little ranch style house way out in the suburbs. And it had this like really crazy vinyl tile flooring that it looked like this. And just because it was like such an imitation of wood, like such a weird textural imitation of wood, I was really struck by, especially in terms of this kind of desire for upward mobility, or these signs of material success in home ownership and home building, following like the desire to assimilate, I guess, or to be successful, to be safe, in this kind of like weird environment. Which comes to Wedgewood. I was thinking a lot about Wedgewood when making this show too, because I think they look really striking, and you grow up seeing them and not knowing exactly when they were made. And I did research, and they're made in like the late 1700s by this guy in England. But what I was really drawn to about them is that they symbolize for me this also like this upward mobility desire, and to like possess these neoclassical images in your own home with these specific shapes of like kind of useless decorative shapes, of like perhaps a culture you have no actual ties to, but by association it elevates your status. And so I made my own Wedgewoods in the shapes of more common objects, like this is a casserole dish, and decorated it with scenes from my maternal grandmother's lives, in thinking about like how often stories of men are told, or like my grandfather was like, or it's like stories like my grandfather fought in the war, he's good. My grandfather was a hero, all stuff like this. And it's like, what was your grandmother doing? What validates her existence? What validates their lives? And so this is an image of a barracks from one of the internment camps where my grandmother spent her teen years. And I was really struck by how similar it looked to aerial views of ranch houses and housing developments that followed during the baby boom, and like the push to live the suburban lifestyle. So this is a frying pan with a ranch house on it, also in the style of Wedgewood. And at this time, I also got really into crocheting, because it's in my mind, such a gendered activity from a specific time. And I associated it a lot with doilies and like grandma house or like grandpa house, and things made inside by older women who are, making things nice for other people.
Did you crochet that doily?
Yeah, I crocheted all the doilies. I got like really into crocheting. Let me see, do I have any other notes on these things? Nope. Oh yeah, and also just this idea of the china cabinet, like I said before, with like Wedgewood being this monument to your family and cultural inheritance. And this is a coffee pot with my maternal grandmother's stuff on it, where she was in Hong Kong during World War II and came to the US as a war bride. And this is her sitting on a bed. And this is images from my grandmother's side, where she was from California and worked in agriculture before being interned, and being a housewife afterwards. And it's a rice cooker.
Tenaya, what do you like? Is there a reason that you find it important to be the one remaking these objects, or like especially crocheting the doilies seems like such a big thing to learn, to be reproducing these items, but same with like the rice cookers and the coffee pots. Is there something specific about like you being the one that's fabricating these things from the ground up?
Yeah, I think that like it's funny, as an undergraduate I was in like sculpture 1, and I made this like funny sculpture that had cookies in it, but because I just didn't know how to operate an oven, I bought the cookies. And something that my TA said, he's like, you should have baked the cookies, because like you made this weird sculpture that is clearly like a sculpture 1 project, but it has store-bought cookies in it, so it kind of ruins the effect of it all. And I was like, whoa, wild. as like a 19-year-old. And so I think that if I'm using this really personal material, it was important that I build all elements of it, because I'm like, well, I'm going to farm my own family's history, so I had better not just be like sucking up other items from like what's it called, provenance, I think is really important to me. because I'm interested in history. I feel like there's a more intelligent way to put that, of something about material significance or history of materials.
We can edit that in later.
Sorry?
We can edit that in later.
Okay, with like a computer voice.
We'll find that philosopher too. We'll add that about the butterfly.
Yeah. I think he's dead. So this was also in that show, and it's also about upward mobility and as everything was in race and assimilation. And it was made thinking about the height of granite countertops and using granite countertops as this also marker of success. And if you have, like, you finally graduate to granite countertops in your house. So the sculpture itself is the height of the countertop, and it has a tile that's pierced with railroad ties to it, just thinking about piercing the US with that railroad, piercing the mountains, and all the violence that entails, so that you can have a suburban house in the end, safe forever in suburban world. And the items that the table is like supported by were thinking about canned food, as also like these symbols of a good American home at a specific time period. There are obviously no longer people think of canned food as a good thing. So yeah, this is a little dog. This is Hachiko, who was a farm dog, who would accompany his master to the train station every day. And his master died at work. And so Hachiko waited at this train station for 9 years and eventually died on the street waiting for his master to return, which I felt like was such a nice metaphor for waiting for white supremacy to embrace you and dying on the street, waiting for approval from your master, who never, is never going to come for you, no matter how much you grovel or wait. So here's actually a statue of Hachiko in Shibuya in Japan, and there's also one at the original train station where he died at. And I also think it's just really compelling. Like, I think pets and dogs in general, you can see I have a pet, are really compelling to me as like these creatures which we project so much of our own desire for like loyalty and comfort from, in these like, maybe they really love us, maybe they don't, it doesn't matter, because ultimately we control their existences. And so I think that's really compelling about dogs and cats and other kind of animals that we have in our domestic spheres, as these kind of like living tools for self-affirmation. And so these are haniwa, which were Kofun era, which is like 3rd to 6th century era funerary objects. And those were what I modeled the cans and Hachiko sculpture after. And just similar idea of just having these things surround you while you die in order to give you comfort, and to give you some kind of like relief as you die. So we have Hachiko and some cans. And those were made out of earthenware, and these are also made out of earthenware too. So that get that material sense to it. So I got really into crochet, as I said earlier, and I also was really obsessed with bears, in the same way I was really thinking about dogs and cats. So I found out that teddy bears were invented as like a popular American toy after Teddy Roosevelt allegedly spared a bear during his hunt, which was brought to him by an underling, and him choosing to be merciful towards it, really touched a lot of people's hearts, and that he didn't choose to kill this bear that was brought to him for him to kill and prove his masculinity. And I was really into Teddy Roosevelt as like this kind of symbol of like foundational American masculinity, of virility. Like he was a really sick kid, but he like had to really prove his masculinity through like hunting, through like his really intense foreign policy of like invading other places so as to better their people and to bring Christianity to them, as most American diplomacy has been throughout history. He also established the national parks in this kind of like stewardship over nature model, in the same way that sparing this bear was his stewardship over nature. So I was really moved by how bears, which are like kind of, you know, like big formidable creatures who have become such an icon of like passivity in, whoa, how did that happen? Of how they can be touched and fondled and squeezed, obviously without them as like an actual being considered. And also was really into like the staining process with this, which is stained with like dirt. I buried it and put steel wool and rusted it over it and bleached it out. Oops. And so these are also these are based off of the Charmin bears, those like poopy toilet paper bears. And they're also made with crochet and rust. And this is also informed a lot by my work as a personal assistant and observing other people in service positions, particularly service positions. And the model of having to, for survival and for being able to have an income, kind of like putting your humanity second and placing your employer's comfort in first place, to be used by another person for their emotional support, while denying yourself these kinds of like emotions. So close up of the poopy bear. And so I made this giant bear out of Lincoln logs, and I love Lincoln logs because they're such an iconic like American frontier toy, and they really fuel that American frontier fantasy for children and help replicate it a lot. Yeah, just thinking about bears, service dogs being used a lot. And I had a lot of fun making this because this is also Speak on Clay. This is stoneware, which is easier because it is less fragile than other things. And I made this by taking molds of walls that I glued together from Lincoln logs and kind of like smushing them all together over plaster molds that I made using like Sculptamold or something from Blix. And moving on. So in thinking about, does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, feel free to write in the chat if you have any questions and we can read them out.
No questions. Okay, so this, thinking about like dogs and subservience and like obedience and loyalty, I started reflecting a lot on how wild religion is. Not to sound really corny, but I went to Catholic school, and my mom's side is Catholic, and I don't think it's necessarily through like a strong passion for Jesus, but through just historical events, became Catholic because of colonizing presences and because of educational access. And I remember when I transferred into a Catholic school, there was like crucifixes in every single room. And I think it's a really intense experience if you're a kid who isn't used to seeing like a half naked man like everywhere who has like fake blood coming out of all these different holes in him. And I remember going to the water fountain in the hallway, and there's just this like 3 foot tall like wooden crucifix hanging over the water fountain. And I don't know, it felt kind of like perverse because he's like so naked and so bloody, and you're just like 8 years old and trying to get a drink of water. And so more recently I've been making these thinking about the stigmata too, which is there's a lot in the Bible about the importance of Jesus's holes that are on his hands and his side from the crucifixion. And these holes are this kind of like point of proof to people to believe that he's like alive or dead or something, or like he's like, he did the resurrection. And there's this really like wild scene in which one of his disciples comes up to him after they think he's dead, and they see him and he's like, "Are you really Jesus?" And he's like, "Thrust your hand into my side hole and you will believe that I'm alive." And he sticks his hand into his hole, and he's in shock because it's really him. So that I'm obviously like really taken with the like super violent erotic part of sticking your hand into someone's hole in order to believe them. And you know, along with dogs and different types of love and obedience to someone else. So this is a foot with a hole in it, styled after a crucifix, and it just says love and obedience. And this is a really dark, I think it's a stoneware, I don't really remember, but I think it's a really beautiful clay. And that glaze is a mix of this like lava stuff that I think is Mako or Duncan mixed with copper oxide powder, and it made this like really beautiful lattice. When I fired it, it was supposed to be an entirely clear hole, but it formed that. So here's another one. Nice holes. These are like the last things that I think I'm finished with, but I haven't been able to really photograph very well. But I made these really wonky nightstands and towers that are actually fountains, along with little goldfish, tons and tons of little goldfish. These are also stoneware, but glazed with the copper oxide and white celadon glaze. Also made with the Lincoln log molds. And similarly thinking about just like power and control. That's about it. Any questions?
Yeah, I'll let's see. I'll set it so if people want to unmute themselves.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question of Tenaya. Tenaya, are you working on anything right now?
I'm not for myself so much. I started working with this collective called CFGNY, which is this like fashion and art collective that mostly uses fashion as a vehicle to think about people. And it thinks a lot about the queer Asian diaspora. And we were planning to go to Jingdezhen this summer to produce new work and think about collectivity, because that place has always been so compelling as a model for collective work. And I've always really wanted to go there, since I know that it's like you go to one place for clay, like one family specializes in clay production, another family specializes in like mold casting, another family specializes in like firing, and it's like a big communal effort to kind of produce all these works, which is really compelling to me. And as just like this like really legendary ceramic production hub in the world, I really wanted to go, but that is obviously postponed indefinitely.
Yeah, I want to go there too really badly. We've been trying to like put a trip together.
Yeah.
When I like first met you, you were making a bunch of functional items. You were making like those little bongs and things like that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, did you ever think about that as like a serious part of your work, or was it more just like a hobby or like a learning experience?
Yeah, that was definitely more of a learning experience and like a hobby. I feel like when I think about work, I feel like especially with ceramics, and I think about like making art with it. I'm like, why does this need to be made with ceramic as opposed to any other material? And when making those little bongs, I just wanted to do it for fun, and I wanted to learn how to make a press mold. And I made these terrible, terrible press molds, and realized I don't have a good brain for making molds, or precision is what I feel like that really requires. But I think that for me, it's really important to be able to mentally separate things that I make for like quote fun, as opposed to things that I make more for showing other people in a different context. Because I think that art is really strange in that it forces you to justify making things or presenting things, of course, which I like to an extent I think is important. You don't want to just like this is some random shit that is really important. But it's kind of the similar kind of like feeling of resistance when I felt really compelled to make all those really bizarre Inuyasha bas reliefs. Was trying to like work out why some things are like viable and other things are not viable. But I made those bongs as like gifts.
Yeah.
To my friends.
Someone wrote in, do you sketch out work before you make it, or does it come during the process?
It comes mostly during the process. It's like I'll have a mental image and then I'll try to make it, and it will be apparent to me that I need to like think more about like how to actually make it. And so that will be the sketching, will be the more like technical aspect of like how to make it actually come into being and not like collapse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like but then there's also, it seems like there's areas where there's your graphical like information that's coming into the work, and then there's also like historical components of like looking up what Wedgewood was and that sort of thing. But do you spend a lot of time like mulling over these concepts, or do you start with like an object and then that sort of like branches out to like say that show at Motel?
I think it's a lot of both, where I generally do start with, I don't know, actually that's hard. I feel like I start with both. Like I'll find an object really compelling. Like I've always found railroad spikes really compelling since my family would drive around around like California and Nevada and Colorado a lot as a kid, and we'd go on a lot of like road trips. And once the car broke down in somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, which was really scary, and we were just sitting by the railroad for like 4 hours in this like excruciating heat, and me and my brother just started pulling ties out of the railroad to pass the time. And my parents obviously were not pleased about this because that's a really dangerous thing to do. But we got to keep them. So I don't know, it was compelling to hold these really, really heavy, rusty spikes that just felt like weapons as a kid. And then I started thinking about how much force it was to drive millions of spikes into the ground over the course of those years using nothing but like a hammer, and all the effort of building these types of things, and then doing more and more research and finding out that, oh, I actually had a great grandparent who did that for a while. And yeah, like the research comes from finding something really compelling, and also finding a material to be really compelling, and seeing like what more is there to look at. And also like seeing these Wedgewood and being like I really want to make something like so perfect and so beautiful. And I think that the perfection and beauty I see in it is that it's so intensely artificial, that, and just realizing I was like, well, I don't have the technical skill to make something so smooth and even and tiny like that, and kind of just falling into being like, well, it's going to look kind of fucked up and ugly, so let's just go with it and make the content match the form.
Yeah.
Okay. Someone wrote in, oh wait, could you expand more on your thoughts about precision and how it might relate to what you were saying earlier about the slipperiness of the content and as you choose?
Yeah, sure. And even as I'm thinking of how to answer this, it sounds like a total cop-out to me. But I think that there's so much slipperiness in history and slipperiness in how we choose to narrativize our existences, and in that a lot of it is based around like someone lived, someone died, they did a good thing, they did a bad thing, they died, like I hold XYZ identity, and that makes me XYZ of a person. Whereas in reality, it's so much slipperier and so much more complicated than that. And I think that this desire to simplify it is, like really lends itself to, I feel like there's probably a really, really articulate, wonderful way to put this, but I feel like the desire to refine it and make things perfect and easily perceivable is a tool of evil, and smooths out narrative so it's easier to digest people and easier to like process them through the powers that be, whether it's like the state or just like capitalism in general. And so I think that this kind of like I think that being precise is really important in thinking about history and why you want to say things or why things happened. But I also think that it's impossible to be totally precise about something because a lot of things are projections. And it's the same way that whenever I read about like non-normative gender in history, it's like we can't apply the language that we use today to refer to people in the past, because people had entirely different understandings of gender and experience, and maybe would not, it doesn't make sense to apply current history to other things that we can't experience ourselves or who can't speak for themselves. Yes.
Makes sense. That was super articulate. And there's another question about the fish. I think the last image that you showed. How did you make them, and what are they made out of?
Oh, okay. So, yes, I love fish. Those last fish were also made out of a white stoneware, where I made them in little pieces. I think I made like the body, and then I made a really thin slab, let it dry a little bit, and then cut out fins and tails and kind of just like squished it all together, and then waited for that to dry and carved it and glazed it.
Nice. Yeah. Did you have fish growing up?
Yeah, I had a lot of fish. They never lasted long, but I've also loved fish because of that, because they're just little people toys.
Yeah.
In that way, where you win them at the fair and they live in a bowl, and it's, I don't know.
If people still like regularly had their childhood betta fish or goldfish or whatever.
Yeah, because it's a really easy way to possess another creature that you are not super emotionally invested in.
Yeah. Cool.
Anyway, cool.
Well, yeah, maybe we'll end it there.
Yeah, this was great.
Thanks, Tenaya.
Thank you very, very much, too. Thank you, everyone.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. See you later. Thank you.